pantomime theatre in Tivoli is, of course, a mime theatre, which has come from the commedia dell'arte tradition. And the pantomime in England is completely different from that. The reason I call my show the Crazy Christmas Cabaret is that I didn't want any of the Danes to mix the two up and to think they were coming to see a show where there was no words and no dialogue. So I obviously had to find another name, because if I'd called it the Great British Pantomime, people would have thought that they were coming on and seeing people mime and things. So I called it the Crazy Christmas Cabaret. But the pantomime in England is a very popular Christmas show, which is on every year and very much a family show. And it's based on a well-known folk tale or a fairy tale, like Sleeping Beauty or Cinderella, Ascapot, or Aladdin. And when I first started the Crazy Christmas Cabaret, many years ago, like actually 30 years ago, in 1982, those were the themes and the subject matters that I chose, because in those days what I was doing was creating or trying to recreate the British traditional pantomime in Denmark. But of course, when you try to recreate something for another country, the whole idea with pantomime is to be very topical and to make it about where you are. So, for example, if your pantomime is in Edinburgh, you make jokes about Scotland. Well, my pantomime was, in the beginning, in Copenhagen. So I made jokes about the Danes and Copenhagen. So what happened over the many years that I've been doing Crazy Christmas Cabaret is that I have developed that. So now the Crazy Christmas Cabaret is no longer anything like a British pantomime. If you went to see a British pantomime now in Britain, you would not see the connection, because now my Crazy Christmas Cabaret is no longer on themes about fairy tales and folk tales. I've gone into other themes, like, for example, Dracula and Sherlock Holmes and Frankenstein and the Mafia and Lord of the Rings. These are not subjects that are ever used for the normal British pantomime. Well, I'm glad they do like my kind of comedy, because they come and see the show, and no theatre's any good unless there's an audience. So yes, the Danes do seem to like my kind of comedy, my kind of sense of humour. And why? Well, I think the Danish sense of humour and the British sense of humour are quite similar in many ways. I think we tend to enjoy the same kind of comedy programs. For example, Monty Python's Flying Circus is extremely popular with the Danes. In fact, Danes can quote from Monty Python, which the English can't do. So the Danes have taken it more to their hearts than even English people have. The Monty Python group are very much based on what we were just talking about, the British pantomime. They always have one of the Python team dresses up as a woman, which is very much in the genre, the convention of the British pantomime, which we call a pantomime dame, which is a man dressed up as a woman. I've taken that idea into my show. Monty Python does the same. But what are the differences people often ask me, what is the difference between Danish humour and English humour? And I think that the Danish humour is actually more hyggelig. It's cozier, it's nicer. The British humour tends to be a little bit tougher and a little bit more satirical. I have a kind of a good way of explaining the difference. I think that in Denmark, if they dressed up a famous Danish comedian, someone like Tommy Kenter, a man, and they dressed him up as an old lady with a wig and an old lady's outfit, put him in a wheelchair and pushed him down a hill towards a brick wall, the Danes would find that very funny. The English would only laugh if that was a real old lady sitting in the wheelchair. So that's how I see the difference between the humour of the Danes and the Brits. I obviously write the script every year, and I get a very quick idea when I'm writing it of what kind of things could come up. And obviously I'm writing a script which has improvisational lines in it. But the whole point about the word improvisation is it's something spontaneous. It's not written in the script. And what I love to do with the Crazy Christmas Cabaret is to make sure that we have opportunities when we're on stage to feel that spontaneity can happen. What I try to do with the Crazy Christmas Cabaret is to create not us and them, us, the actors, them, the audience. I try to create a little sort of a family group almost, where we're actually in this together. I'm kind of saying to my audience, let all of us, let's be kids or unsophisticated and unintellectual for a few hours and just go a bit crazy. So then, which is the crazy Christmas Cabaret, of course. And so then to do that, what I try to do is make parts of the show where things can go wrong. And that is, of course, when I get people up on stage. I always get people up on stage every year. And people sometimes say to me, are they real people you get up on stage or are they planted in the audience? They're definitely real people. Of course, I'm very careful who I select. I look very carefully at people at the beginning of the show, decide who I think might be a good person to bring up on stage. Obviously, don't go for somebody who's too old, who can't get up the stairs, or too young, who's maybe, be silly or be drunk or something. So when I get somebody up on stage, I actually never know what's going to happen. It's the unpredictable part of the show. So that's fun, and then we can improvise around that. The other time when improvisation comes into the Crazy Christmas Cabaret is when things can go wrong on stage. Anything can go wrong because it's live theatre. Your costume can drop off. You can trip over something on the set. You can drop a prop. Somebody can laugh in the audience at a point you didn't expect them to laugh, and you think, well, I can't ignore that, so you can use it and come up with a funny response to that person laughing or to that person's comment. So those things can happen all the time. And what's fun about those, and they tend to happen at some point during the run of the show, and what's fun about those moments is that they are completely improvised and they're completely unexpected, and the audience can see that. So we have fun on stage and the audience have fun watching us deal with that problem. The way I work, well, okay. What I do, the Crazy Christmas Cabaret, I've been writing it and directing it for 30 years now. So what happens is that in the middle of the run of the show that I'm doing, around about December, I decide what the next year's show is going to be. I don't decide anything else other than the theme of the show and the title of the show. And once I've decided that has to be, that I can't change my mind about that, because I have to give the title of the show for the following year's show already at the end of January. So that it's in the established theatre brochures. So that cannot be changed. Now, for example, let's take this year. Already during last year's show, I was doing a show last year called Below the Belt, which was all about being in the jungle, the equatorial forest, and Tarzan and the apes. And I decided that next year, which is this year, I wanted to do something completely different, because I tried to change the style and the themes so that they're very different from each other from year to year. Over the years, of course, I've gone through all sorts of eras. I've been back to the gladiator period. I've been to the French Revolution. I've been to the 19th century. So this time I thought, okay, I'm doing Africa and I've got people running around in loincloths and leopard skin bikinis. So what am I going to do next year? I decided to do a Hitchcock theme. Now, as soon as I decide a theme, which in this case is Hitchcock, I start to do all the research about that theme. So with Hitchcock, it was to see as many documentaries about Hitchcock as possible, read books about him, see as many, of course, of his films as possible. He did make 58 films, so that was a little bit difficult for me to do. And I certainly avoided the silent movies. And I decided out of all the films that he did, which films I was going to use as a basis for my show. Because I don't take one Hitchcock film, I'm taking an amalgamation, a compilation of many of his films, and making my own storyline where I can play with some of the ideas. Now, the thing about Hitchcock, of course, is that he has certain themes. His themes are very much connected to a man being caught doing a crime he didn't do and having to escape from the police. His themes are based on psychological things. He was one of the very first directors to take a big interest in psychology in his movies. So a lot of his characters have got big problems. They're kleptomaniacs, or they're claustrophobic, or they've got HITCHCOCK, vertigo, or they're serial murders, like a film like Psycho. Psycho is possibly his best-known film. Everybody knows that Hitchcock directed Psycho. And possibly the second best-known film is The Birds. So these two films then, of course, become the basis of this year's show. And that's the next thing I do, is work out a sort of plot, But I have a huge challenge because I don't just take Hitchcock and his themes and his films and make them into another Hitchcock possible adaptation. What I have to do is to make it funny, to make it crazy funny. So that's a big challenge for me, especially with something like Hitchcock. The other huge challenge with Hitchcock is that he is famous for his films, for his cinema, and I'm doing a show in a theatre on a stage. So that's been quite a challenge too. So the point is that when I've got through that process, the next thing, of course, I do is to find my cast. I go to England, I hold auditions, I choose actors. I always choose my actors before I write my script, because when I'm writing the script, I have these actors in my head. I have their faces, I see them, and many of the actors I use time and time again, year after year, so I know what they're good at. I know their talents, I know their fortes, and I can play with those, and I can write for them. So when I'm writing their lines, I'm hearing them speak, which is a huge advantage for a writer. So I choose my actors, and then of course I have my kernel, my core group for London Toast Theatre, my theatre company, that I use every year to do the technical sides. I change them occasionally, but on the whole, I keep to a family of people that I work with every year, which is, of course, most important of all, my costume and set designer, who we've worked together for 25 years, so we know each other very well. We have a kind of shorthand, and we can work together to create what people see in a crazy Christmas cabaret when they come and sit in the audience and look at the stage. Then, of course, I have a choreographer because the show is a musical with dancing and musical numbers, so I need a choreographer. I have a musical director and a musical arranger. Usually in every show, I write together with him at least 1 or 2 numbers. The others are well-known songs that everybody recognizes, but we try to write 1 or 2 numbers that are original. And then, of course, I have my lighting designer, I have my sound designer, and I have my band. So I have a live band who sit up on what we call the ashtray, which is the little box in Glass Salem where they sit. Last year I had them on stage, but usually they sit up there. And so this is my group of people, my stage management, of course, my production manager, all these people. It means that it's a large group of people. So when the machine of a crazy Christmas cabaret begins, which is with the first day of rehearsal, then from that moment on, we work towards the opening night. We rehearse for 4 weeks, which is quite unusual because Danish theatre companies usually rehearse for at least 2 months. We pack it all into 4 weeks, which is quite difficult because it is not just words, it's the music, it's the musical numbers, there's the choreography to be learned. There's so much going on in those 4 weeks, and everybody works really hard. This year, because it's based on Hitchcock, we've also got a lot of projections. We're using a flat screen, LED panels, and we're creating a lot of filmic stuff on the stage to play with the idea of the cinema and the theatre and using them together and meshing them so that they combine, sometimes overlap with each other. So we're being quite innovative, I think, this year because the subject matter has very much given us the possibility to do that. So what happens during the whole process of the work is that once I get to the rehearsal stage, then I have all the hats on my head at the same time, because I have to sit there and direct the actors. I'm also an actor myself, so sometimes I jump up and I get on the stage and I have to do the scenes that I'm in. And at the same time, I'm a producer of the company, so I have to make sure that the program is the way I want it to look, that the advertising and the marketing is going the way I want it to go. And so all these things are stuff I'm doing all sort of simultaneously. So for me, those 4 weeks are possibly the busiest time of my whole year. But they're challenging and they're fun, and I work with some very, very talented people. I have learned over the years to delegate. It's very important to learn to delegate and to also trust the people that you employ, that they're good at their job, because then you can sit back and do what you think you're good at or what you feel you're good at. So altogether, it's a teamwork. And the thing about any theatre production is it's a real team that work together because we have a deadline. And the deadline is the opening night when in Glassalen, nearly 1,000 people sit there and they watch that show. And that is when most people think my job is over. But it's not, because the very first time I have an audience, which is the first voorpremiere, the first preview show, that is when I find out how an audience is reacting to what I wrote all those months before. That is when I hear what they laugh at, what they don't laugh at, what I think I can change, what I feel is possibly a bit long and could be cut down, what I feel maybe I should take a number out and make it a bit shorter or put in a different number, a musical number. And all those decisions are made in the period of the voorpremiere, the preview period, which these days we use about 3 or 4 voorpremières before we get to the opening night, the proper premiere, the big gala premiere, which is when we invite all friends and important people to come and see what we've been putting together all that time. But by then, I should be happy with what I've created, if all goes well. But of course, you know, sometimes I'm not. So even sometimes a week in or 2 weeks into the show, I can change it. Plus the fact I do like to change things if anything topical happens. Well, we're both English, yeah, that's the connection. Well, Alfred Hitchcock is British. Some people actually think he's American because a lot of his films were made in America. But actually, he didn't move to America till 1940, by which time he'd already made about 30 films. So he was a famous film director in Britain before he ever even moved to America. But that probably, if you're asking me what is a connection between somebody like Alfred Hitchcock and myself, I don't know. The desire. Alfred Hitchcock loved the theatre. He went a lot to the theatre, and you can find theatre in his films. He even made a film called Stage Fright, which is all about an actress played by Marlene Dietrich, who is actually an actress in a play. And 39 Steps, which is another famous Hitchcock film, actually the whole climax of the film takes place in a theatre. When he was a boy, he loved to go to the theatre. If you're finding comparisons, when I was a girl, I loved to go to the theatre. And Alfred Hitchcock went to the theatre all his life. He was fascinated by the theatre. And you could say I'm now fascinated by cinema. So in that sense, we're crisscrossing. So, but he also, Hitchcock, was a great joker. He loved to include jokes in his films. And he also loved to play around with his audiences the way I do. He always appeared in his films. He came on as an extra in every single one of his better-known films, well, after he came to America at least, as an extra. He went on once, I think the first time was because they actually needed somebody to walk across the set in a scene, and there was nobody available, so he said, I'll do it. Now, Hitchcock had a very, very recognizable shape. He was a fat man. And that famous silhouette of him that we all know from the television programs that he made is of his marvelous silhouette and his rather 3 chins. So when he walked across the screen in that Hitchcock extra walk-on moment, you actually couldn't miss him. So what he started to do was put it into every film. It became his kind of little signature, was Hitchcock walking somewhere or sitting next to somebody. And you can see it and you can find it in every film if you look out for it. What he decided to do as he became more and more famous as a film director and his movies became more famous is he put that moment at the beginning of the film so that it didn't distract from all the excitements and the suspense that came later. Now, the connection here is that I put myself in the Crazy Christmas Cabaret in a role which was unexpected, which is the character of Dr. Van Helsingor from Helsingor. He's a running character. He's in every Crazy Christmas I do. Dr. Van Helsingor is in the show, in some way or another, a cameo role, or maybe he just has a tiny thing to do. Sometimes he's got a bigger role. But I put that in. The thing about Hitchcock was he liked to play around. And play with conventions and play with running gags. And that's what I like to do. So there's a connection there. Well, first of all, they come to see a show where they hear English spoken for 2.5 hours. That's a pretty good start. Also, every year there's something they can learn about the theme that I'm using. And this year, possibly, I think, even more educational than usual. Because I think everybody should know who Alfred Hitchcock is. He has been called the genius of cinema. Some people say he's the greatest ever film director. So, you know, if students can find out a little bit more about Alfred Hitchcock, then that's a good thing. I also think in the classroom, if one's getting more interested in Hitchcock, they can also see the interviews that he made with François Truffaut, who's a famous French film director. And those are fascinating, because if they're actually studying French, they can get a bit of French out of it as well. So there's a lot, I think, to be gained out of this year's show, this year's theme. And just basically, I think the educational value is sitting in a theatre, listening to English and picking up different phrases and different expressions and enjoying the English sense of humour. Well, if they say his English is not so good, that means their English isn't very good when they said so. Yeah, of course, the character they're talking about is the one I've just mentioned. And he is this Danish character that I have created called Dr. Van Helsingor from Helsingor. And he was created way back in 1986. My goodness, when I did a production of Dracula. Now, most people know that the man who hunted down Dracula, his name was Dr. Van Helsing, and he was a Dutchman. Well, when I was writing the show based on Dracula, I wanted to use this character, and I looked at that word Helsing, and I thought, that looks like Helsingor. I thought, I know what I'll do. I won't make him Dutch. I'll make him Danish, and I'll call him Dr. Van Helsingor from Helsingor. So that's how he came about. Then I decided that nobody else could possibly play this character except me, because all the actors I use are English actors who can't speak with a Danish accent the way I can do. So I decided that meant that I would have to play this character and dress up as a man. And I wanted to disguise myself as much as possible. So I wear a red beard and glasses and a silly hat and everything and a yaka set. And I come on as this character. Now, over the years, Dr. Van Helsingor has become a running character, as I said before. He is my running figure in every crazy Christmas cabaret since 1986. One year, you say people complained that I have used him because he speaks bad English. But one year they complained because I didn't put him in the show. And people actually refused to leave the auditorium until Dr. Van Helsingor came on stage. So he was kind of popular with those teachers, at least, or those members of the audience. But Dr. Van Helsingor does speak appallingly bad English, I have to say. And as such, he's a big, big exception in Denmark, because the Danes speak wonderful English. And he's very exceptional. And I think sometimes you can learn and use him as a kind of demonstration model for how not to speak English. So that when students listen to Dr. Van Helsingor talking, instead of saying, oh, hoorlijke, he will say over the head not, for example. Or when he's talking about his own name, because his name is Bent Van Helsingor. He, of course, then found out, somebody told him that the name Bent in English is a slang word for being homosexual. And he said, "Det kommer helt bag på mig." This is coming completely behind me. Now, this kind of comment, of course, has double meanings and has lots of humorous meanings. And that way I can use Dr. Van Helsingor to put lots of funny things into the dialogue of the show. When people misunderstand what he says. He's a doctor, so when he talks to somebody on stage, he says, "I am a good lay." He, of course, means a lay, but in English, a lay is somebody who's good in bed. So when he says, "I'm a good lay," they go, "Oh, doctor, really?" So I can play around with the language. So the reason that I use Dr. Van Helsingor is to have fun with the Danish and English language, or Danglish, as I would call it. So the teachers who complain, I would say, instead of complaining, maybe use him as an example as how not to get your students to speak English.